Thank you, Steve and Yvette, especially for organizing, and Citrus for having me here. At the end, if you have questions about how I went from West Point to being a philanthropic engineer at Palantir, I'm happy to answer that question. It's kind of a fun story. But what I'm going to talk about today is some of the philanthropic work that we're doing at Palantir, and focusing specifically on the disaster relief and humanitarian efforts that I focus on most closely. The story starts, and I never quite know how much people know about Palantir, because we don't make sort of consumer software, so the brand is not as well known as many other companies in Silicon Valley. But Palantir has actually been around since about 2004. The original engineers and sort of the impetus grew out of PayPal. And an effort to fight fraud at PayPal. You remember back in the early 2000s, there was intense competition among online payment processors. And a lot of the challenge there was not moving money back and forth from account to account. That's relatively simple. The challenge in those early days was doing that without getting ripped off totally by the Russian mob. Because there was very, very well organized and focused efforts to commit fraud. And so all of these companies had to find ways to counter that. And most of them settled on methods related to essentially building very sophisticated algorithms that were usually very hard to put together. They worked great once. And then the adaptive adversary that was the Russian mob would recognize that their SOPs were being uncovered and would change those tactics. And so the insight that PayPal took, and what allowed them to be successful, was they realized that they needed to keep a human being a human analyst very much in the loop to sort of pick up patterns and changes of behavior in response to an adaptive adversary. But they still had to sort tremendous amounts of information in terms of IP addresses, transactions, account numbers, all of these sorts of things. And so that basically is the insight that became Palantir, is to give a human analyst, a subject matter expert, the ability to explore very large amounts of data in a variety of different ways. Data that oftentimes is originally sitting in disparate data sets that were not designed in many cases to work together. But fundamentally to have that human being in the loop, to give that human being the ability to sort of intuitively explore this information, with the idea being that you take a subject matter expert, whether it's in fraud in online payments, whether it's in counterterrorism, whether it is in healthcare, or whether it's in disaster relief, and you give that subject matter expert the ability to sort data in ways that previously only a data scientist or a statistician or somebody might be able to do. And so that's the insight that became Palantir. The sort of product really matured in 2008. The first customers were in the national security space. Most of the customers now are large financial institutions, and that's that's where the heart of the sort of business growth is. But as time went on, the fundamental core of what Palantir was founded around was the idea to be able to solve, quote unquote, solve the world's hardest problems. And that is very much an ethos that remains with the company today, to take on the world's hardest problems. So Dr. Karp, our CEO, were he here, he would say, look, there's a lot of wonderful organizations out there that are taking on the world's hardest problems. Some of them can pay and some of them can't. And the philanthropy team grew out of the idea that some of them can't. And so the philanthropy team was stood up in the middle of 2012, and that's right about the time that I came on board. We have a couple of major focus areas. One is disaster relief and sort of humanitarian assistance in general. One is support for veteran communities in the United States. Another that is really a major one is counter human trafficking. So we work with a number of organizations, but specifically the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in Washington, and a group called the Polaris Project. The Polaris Project does really great work. They run the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So, if folks see something, if they are a victim themselves, They will call this hotline. And you know, the story of what we did for them, I think, is actually kind of interesting. I'm not going to show that one to you, but I'll describe it a little bit, because I think it's kind of interesting where what you're really doing at the end of the day is really quite simple, right? You're just trying to make information functional for a human user so that they can make a decision very quickly. That's really all you're doing in this case. So what they're doing is they've got folks answering the calls that come in from all sorts of folks. Most of these people are not victims, but some of them are. And some of these calls are from victims that are literally hiding in the bathroom while their pimp has fallen asleep in the main room. And what they're looking for is to be connected to a resource of some kind. Maybe it is a shelter for women. Maybe it is law enforcement. Maybe it is some sort of mental health hotline. And what becomes difficult about this is that the legal protocols around the country are very, very different depending on where you are. And the resources that are available in different places are very, very different depending on where you are. So what we've done in that particular case is integrated the data about where the protocols are, defined geographically, integrated the data about where these resources are, and created a relatively simple front end that allows for an analyst, when they get the call, just to type in, to understand where that call is coming from, and very easily understand the protocols that they have to follow legally, and then get information on where they can refer that person to go. It's really a pretty simple workflow, but it's a situation where before they were digging that information out, they were either Googling for it, they were digging it out of pieces of paper, and it would take them 2 or 3 minutes to get that answer. Now it takes 10 seconds. And that time difference doesn't matter every time, but when it does matter, it matters a lot, right? And so that is just one example, right? In general, in our philanthropic projects, we are not dealing with data at the scale of our commercial customers, right? Not dealing with data at the scale of a large financial institution or a credit card company or something like that. Usually the problem in our philanthropic projects is that the data is a lot messier, right? It's not collected in sort of very strict ways. It's not, most of the time, as I'll show you, it's collected by people in very difficult circumstances, and they're trying to mash it up and just get a sense of how do I make a decision, right? I just need to make a decision. The decision I'm going to make is going to be based on dramatically imperfect information. How do I make that information as perfect as I can? And so that's where we get to some of the disaster relief stuff. We started doing disaster relief after I met a guy named Jake Wood, who's the president of an organization called Team Rubicon, which is a veterans-based organization in LA, and they do disaster relief operations. So they had the insight that there is this community of veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan. Many of these people, to be perfectly blunt, are having a hard time integrating into civilian society. But they come with these tremendous skills for dealing with chaos. And many of them are looking for purpose. They're looking to serve. And they're looking for community out of those veterans. And so Team Rubicon is an organization that tried to sort of have this dual purpose of a mission of this disaster relief effort, coupled with sort of as a intended byproduct, creating community around for these veterans that are coming back. It's really quite tremendous, and they are a wonderful organization. So I met Jake at a conference in San Diego. I was looking for an organization that we could start with in this disaster relief world. I knew starting off, we weren't ready to sort of, raise our hand and offer to work with the Red Cross. We needed to start smaller. We needed to start with an organization that was willing to be nimble and try something new. And Jake basically said, I have no idea who you are or what your company does or what's going on. But he was willing to take a gamble. And the first thing that they wanted to do was be able to look at a map and draw a radius and find all their volunteers that fell inside that radius, right? Because they're looking to see who should we activate when there is a disaster in Topeka, Kansas, right? Who lives nearby? That was pretty simple. So we did that. And then Hurricane Sandy hit New York. And it was literally hit the day that I was going to demonstrate what we had done, this very simple integration, data integration, for Jake. And he didn't answer the phone, and I kept calling and harassing him. And he said, Brian, look, if you want to talk to me, he ultimately said, Brian, if you want to talk to me, you got to come to New York. And so we said, screw it, let's go to New York. And that is very much the ethos of a company like Palantir. We, in a way that I think is quite unique, have a concept of forward deployed engineering where we will put our engineers into the field and ask them to write code when it's cold, wet, hot, dry, late, etc., to customize the platform for a particular use case. And we do that regularly. We do that with all of our clients. And so when I said, called my leadership and said, look, I need a couple of engineers. We need to go live in a warehouse for a couple of weeks, an unheated warehouse in Brooklyn, and spend all of our days in 30-degree weather out in the Rockaways. And they're going to need to write some code while we're there because we really have no idea what we're getting ourselves into. The answer was, yeah, sure, go. And that was wonderfully empowering. I didn't know that I would get that answer, but we did. And so we showed up. I still remember vividly flying in over Staten Island with all the lights out, which was a terrifying experience at night. It was really quite scary. And we lived in a warehouse in Brooklyn. And the first day that we went out with the Team Rubicon volunteers. So Team Rubicon is what they call a VOAD, or a voluntary organization active in disaster, which is an acronym I didn't know before I started this work. The Red Cross is another. There's many of them around the country. And what they would do, their workflow was they would, on day one, they would send a bunch of people walking around the neighborhood. They would walk up to the house. They would knock on the door. They would see if there was a homeowner home. They would write down on a piece of paper whether that person requested help. At the end of the day, they would take all those pieces of paper. They would sort of sort them out, put them into binders, and the next day hand those binders to team leaders that would go out and lead volunteers to go do some cleanup at that house. In the Rockaways, for the most part, that meant taking sand and water out of people's basements. Right? That process is incredibly inefficient. Right? And one of the reasons why it's inefficient is because there are so many different, quote-unquote, VOADs operating at the same time in the same place. And so somebody walks up, and they say, hey, do you need some help? And the homeowner says, yeah, we do. And they say, okay, we're going to be back tomorrow at 9 in the morning. And the homeowner says, great. And then some other group walks up and says, hey, I've got 5 people with me right now. Should we just, you want us to take care of this? And the homeowner, of course, says, yeah, of course, obviously. Right? But then you've got that other group that comes back the next day, and they've wasted all of this time. And in an environment, in a disaster environment where mobility, just the logistics of getting around, can be really difficult, you lose a lot. You lose a lot of capability in that setting, right? And so what we did basically is we gave them Palantir Mobile, which is an application that at the time was designed just for an Android phone. It gave them the ability to fill out a form to do a report, take a photo of the house, geocode automatically, sync that through the cell network to a laptop sitting forward at what the Team Rubicon, who were led by a bunch of Marines, would call a forward operating base, a FOB. And they would triage almost in real time to figure out where they were going to send folks to go. They can task from the, and I'm not going to walk through all of this because I'm going to show some of the web-based front ends instead. But we can task folks to the phone. We can track all of those teams via the phone in real time, so a Blue Force tracking capability to use, again, some of the military nomenclature. And so what that gives you the ability to do is just allocate resources more efficiently. That's all it was. At the end of the day, that's all you're doing, is allocating resources more efficiently. And so the big win, though, was that this capability of gathering information and being able to triage it and make very precise decisions about where you wanted to allocate those resources gave Team Rubicon the ability to take advantage of another resource. And that other resource is what, in the VOAD community, is often called the disaster after the disaster, which is this influx of spontaneous volunteers, people that are not associated with a major organization, and they just want to help. And they wind up showing up in these places, and because they're not organized, and there isn't really a formal infrastructure to take advantage of these people most of the time, they just get in the way, right? That was a real risk in the Rockaways. But because TR had done this work and had gathered this information, we wrote an algorithm that allowed you to very easily draw a geographic box around a series of geolocated objects, which were this quote-unquote structure assessment reports, these reports that were being done by mobile device. Say, I want to divide up these objects into 5 teams, do it, and the algorithm essentially spits out five folders with, that optimizes on geographic proximity and the type of damage done in the house, right? Now that's pretty simple. That algorithm didn't exist before. We didn't have that done. It was written by a guy named Mo Makdi. He was Egyptian guy. He was shot in the neck protesting Mubarak in Tahrir Square. He wrote that algorithm in the Veterans Green Bus for a bunch of Marines in the Rockaways. It was really a wonderful story. And so what that gave Team Rubicon the ability to do, though, is when spontaneous volunteers would walk up and say, what can I do? They said, well, we're going to send 2 Marines with you and print out a couple of reports, houses that we know you can go to. We know they need help. Go. Right? And so all of a sudden you're taking advantage of this resource that was traditionally underutilized in these situations. That became a huge win. President Clinton came out. We were able to brief him in the Rockaways. It was pretty amazing. And things took off from there. So this consortium of us, Team Rubicon, and then another organization called Direct Relief, which is based down in Santa Barbara, made what's called a commitment to action to the Clinton Global Initiative. And this was basically a commitment to use new technology in disaster relief and humanitarian assistance settings, right? It wasn't a lot more precise than that. So basically, we were able to make a major impact in the Rockaways. But we also recognized that we had a lot to learn. And so we spent most of 2013 deploying with Team Rubicon to tornadoes around the United States, Moore, Oklahoma, various floods. And we knew that we weren't really ready to go to an international deployment. There were some challenges there. It was going to be a different kind of lift. The logistical issues are more severe. And then Typhoon Haiyan, or Typhoon Yolanda, as it was known locally, hit the Philippines. And both Direct Relief and Team Rubicon said, we're going, will you help us? And we basically said, well, we can't say no. This is one of those crises where you don't, if you have the ability to help, you don't sit on the sideline. But we ran into a real problem, which is that this key workflow that we had developed was built around the cell system and these mobile devices, right? And those mobile devices, the app would work offline, and then you could sync the data later. That's fine. We'd worked all of that out, but it still wasn't going to cut it for what we were used to in terms of having real-time information about where your people are, real-time information flowing in from the field, right? That's the gold standard. That's what we were looking for. We needed to figure out a way to do it. We had no idea. But what we did is we found this. I don't know if anybody's seen one of these. This is an off-the-shelf piece of equipment made by a company called DeLorme. Hikers use these. It's called an InReach device. And what's unique about this is that it's a GPS locator, which means that it just syncs directly through the Iridium satellite network, your location. But what it can also do is it can send what essentially is a tweet, a 160-character message off of this device, right? 2 ways. And so what we did is we worked with DeLorme to update the software on this so that you could use this very simple sort of 4-way button here to fill out forms on the device, which would create a very compressed message that when it hit our servers, we would expand out into something human readable. And the end result of that was a system where we could have blue force tracking, 2-way communication, and systematized reporting from anywhere in the world, regardless of cellular connectivity in real time, which doesn't exist, hadn't existed before. That process sits in this, which is what we call Raven. This is a beta product. It's a web-based map. What's really unique about this product is it does almost all of the processing on the back end and then serves up the data that you see on the map as tiles. So it's recreating tiles all of the time and serving that from the back end. What that means is that we can, not with the hardware we're using here, but we can push up to 1 billion objects onto this map and index them in a reasonable amount of time. This is really cool. And the devs that made it, we basically said, look, we need an interface. We've got to make this happen on short notice, right? Usually the devs, at a place like Palantir are almost off limits. They are working on abstract processes that what we call forward deployed engineers are able to customize for particular use cases. In this case, we went straight to the dev team and said, we have an acute crisis. We need help. Can you do this? And they put together the interface where we're pulling from the Delorme API, pulling this information in, and creating Palantir objects in real time. So what does that look like? So you can see the sort of messaging over here on the right. These are what these messages actually look like. Let me zoom in on this one. Something about this browser is displaying a little bit weird, but that's okay. So you can see this is what a message looks like. And now I'm going to do what we would call a geo search. In this particular place. So now I'm querying the actual Palantir database to try to pull up the Palantir objects that were created out of this message that I'm showing on the right. And what we're looking for here is the health facility assessment. Now, why were we assessing health facilities? The reason, you can see what it looks like, right? So facility condition, moderately damaged. It's open, though. Patients for next week, etc. Right? The reason why we're doing this is that our partner Direct Relief, which was our primary partner on this effort, Direct Relief was looking at the Philippines and saying, what they do is they take medical devices and pharmaceuticals, they ship them out to clinics around the world where they're needed, right? And so they're trying to figure out, well, what is this? We don't have a very clear list of where all the real clinics are in the Philippines. We don't know which ones are completely useless because they've been knocked over. We don't know which ones have cold storage facilities so they can actually store a vaccine in a functional way. And so that's the kind of information that they wanted. And it's very simple, except it's hard to get that in real time to update, so that they can make decisions with it. So that's what we did. And if I zoom out a little bit, I can show you the rest of the island of Leyte. And give you a sense of sort of, this is just Palantir personnel running around, right? This is mostly just for a demonstration case, but it shows you where we were, right? The point being, though, that the reason why we could integrate the information coming off of these devices in a matter of 2 or 3 days and create this capability is that the fundamental purpose and functionality of Palantir is that it is a generic data integration platform, right? So that whatever the originating data source, the scripts to integrate that information are nearly identical, and they can be used on basically any pre-existing data, right? So from our perspective, there wasn't anything all that special about this. It was just another data source, right? And that fundamentally is the thesis of Palantir, right? Is that it doesn't matter where the data comes from. We don't collect the data, but we can integrate it regardless, right? So that's what that is. So what's some other data that we threw in here to help folks make decisions? Would be a reasonable question. So there's a range of things. So relief infrastructure, for example. This is data that comes from the Google Crisis Map. There's a crowdsourced effort via Google to sort of identify different facilities. And if I draw a box around it, you can index, everything that's there. Like I said, that will work up to 1 billion objects if you've got the right hardware, which this is not. This actually is hosted on the AWS stack in Singapore. We tried to host as close to the Philippines as reasonably possible. So we've got stuff like that. If we go to damage assessments, all of those little red dots, I'll pull one up. This data comes from something called TomNod, which is a product of a company called Digital Globe. And Digital Globe is a satellite data provider, a satellite imagery provider, and they have a system where they sort of crowdsource images of post-disaster environments. Those are coded by the crowd. We're pulling that dynamically in here, right? It comes with the KML of the shot itself. We also took another feed from Digital Globe that actually pulled in larger scale satellite imagery of the affected areas. Right? Again, the idea being that you can take different kinds of data, display them in the same place, and allow people to make decisions. So we can do some heat mapping stuff. I don't know. We can run through a range of these. If we do structures, for example, that'll take a sec. This stuff is up from OpenStreetMaps. But 47,000 structures of various types, right? So that gives you this sort of sense of what we were trying to do. Actually, let me drill back down really quick to ORMOC, which is where I was showing you this information before. Close those out. Seems like I've lost ORMOC. Got it. I'm going to do another geo search, and what I'm going to pull up this time is, another question that you might ask if you're looking to sort of push information to, or push resources to a hospital in the city of ORMOC, is you might want to know what other people are doing in the immediate vicinity of that hospital. And so one of the data sets that we integrated here is data from the United Nations. And so what this is directly from, the way the UN works in these situations is that there are a bunch of NGOs doing work in various areas. They push information up to what they call the cluster system. So there's a cluster for like water and sanitation. There's a cluster for livelihood. There's a cluster for housing. And then those clusters push information up to the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, right? UN OCHA. And so what we're doing here is we're taking data at the layer between the cluster and OCHA. That data is ridiculously bad. It comes in a range of spreadsheets, which are not consistently formatted, even from the same cluster iteration to iteration. And what happens is that there are a bunch of very smart people that work for the UN that spend their time integrating that data into single spreadsheets so that they can understand what's happening in a comprehensive way. So what we did is Pablo wrote some really sophisticated scripts to do what seems like it ought to be relatively simple, to deal with sort of dynamically formatted spreadsheets and pull those in dynamically. And what that did is it gave us the ability to understand what was happening within the UN system. So if we can see, this is live data, this is up to date according to what the UN is actually looking at in the Philippines. So we want to see, just drill down on what's ongoing. Couple of things. Those are the various activities. We can look at the protection cluster in particular and say, okay, so here's a HelpAge is the organization, psychosocial activity for patients, older people, women, and children. And that's what's going on, right? This is just a useful way, at the end of the day, what they're trying to do in the Philippines is very similar to what we were trying to do in the Rockaways and what folks in disaster environments and in lots of other environments are doing all over the world, which is identifying where there is need and where there's a lack of services. Right? It's just, at the end of the day, it's a gap analysis. Where is their need that I can plug into, right? So another way to look at that is just, again, we're feeding off the same back end, and this is just another web portal The main sort of primary analytical front end for Palantir is actually a Java application. We're moving away from that for, as you might suspect, for all sorts of reasons, to a fully HTML5 based format, but we still do use the Java application for some things. We're in the process of that transition. I'm not going to show you the Java. If you're really curious, I can show it to you afterwards. But here's another way of looking at this. This is just a series of dashboards. This feeds dynamically off of the same back end that we were looking at on the map. The data is relatively up to date. These are the last polls that we had, and the matrix here is something that we did in response to a kind of analysis that folks in the international community were already doing, where they were taking data on the vertical axis there that's coming from the Philippine government. And in this particular, what they're saying is, like, how many people were affected by disaster in this particular province? Along the horizontal axis is how many activities are being done by UN-affiliated NGOs in that particular province, right? According to quote-unquote cluster, right? So the idea there is, at a very high level, where are we doing things where there is need, and where is there need that we are not doing anything, right? That's basically what they're trying to get at. The problem is that to create this matrix would take a day, right? Just to integrate the data and then manually create a fixed PDF, right? And so we spent a couple days writing the appropriate scripts, writing this front end, but now it takes about 20 minutes, right? Once the data comes in, we just need to run a script over it, ingest the data, and the matrix updates automatically, right? So if we look around here, just scrolling through, we can see ELO, lots of people affected, lots going on. Same in Leyte, lots of people affected, lots going on. But if we scroll up to Bohol, according to this, and the Philippine government, more than 1 million people are affected by disaster in the province of Bohol, which is an island just south of Leyte. I don't know how many of you know Philippines geography. I didn't really know Philippines geography that well until recently, but now I do. So 1 million people affected by disaster in Bohol, and the UN is only tracking that they are doing 2 things in this particular place. Why is that? And the reason is that Bohol was not hit by Typhoon Haiyan. It was hit by an earthquake 3 weeks beforehand, and the international community didn't care. And that's why we see that discrepancy there. But that's the kind of the idea here, is to be able to sort of explore this information dynamically, explore the same data in a variety of different ways, right? If we go through, if anybody wants to see the Java app, I'll show you. That's basically the idea. It's a single Java platform with a range of applications to cut the same data in different ways, right? Using some basic statistics, throw things on a map, look at things in network diagrams, and that's the core idea. The other thing is this is, as you might expect, it's dynamic. If we want to drill down on Capiz, for example, I'm logged out. But if we want to drill down on something, we can turn, in organizations, whether they are governmental organizations, NGOs, or international organizations, the turn on information tends to be very, very slow. So if you want to know what's going on in Capiz as a senior leader, you say, hey, can I get more information on Capiz, the province of Capiz? And it'll take a day or 2 for everybody to get back to you, while 5 or 6 people scramble around to dig up that data. Having it all integrated into a dynamic format gives you the ability to, just with a click of a button, say what's going on here, right? And so that fundamentally is what we're about. So in terms of the, I think I've illustrated this, and I want to make sure I leave time for questions. So, but before I do that, I'm just going to sort of talk a little bit about the way forward for us, which is we've had a lot of success now working with specific organizations and improving their internal operations, right? And that improvement is actually pretty dramatic. But we still haven't totally cracked the nut of facilitating better interaction across different organizations. And that's something that Palantir is disposed to do. But we do run into, at the end of the day, we are technologists. We are a technology company. We can't be the ones that are organizing collaboration and finding agreement across multiple organizations to collaborate. And we still need to work with those folks that have the authority and, frankly, the expertise to find the best mechanisms for information sharing. Because one of the things that you get in these situations is, whether it's domestic or international, you might say folks don't necessarily want to share, right? And sometimes there are good reasons and sometimes there are bad reasons, right? Sometimes there are good reasons are we're gathering medically sensitive information. We don't want to share that because of HIPAA regulations, right? Sometimes there are bad reasons, which is we want to do all this work so that we can submit a bill to the local county and get paid as an organization, right? Which I would throw that into a bad reason, right? If it slows down the response. So we have a few ways to deal with this. Palantir has really granular access controls so that we can limit data sharing or unintended data sharing, data spillage. And that pays off, right? It pays off in a situation like in the Philippines, where we had developed a data environment that everybody wanted access to, right? Including the U.S. Marines that were responding to help the Philippine government in the Philippines, right? Our NGO partners, though, did not want to be gathering information and have that matriculate directly to the U.S. military. And in this particular case, there's very little sensitivity, but NGOs around the world, humanitarian organizations, have very good reasons for wanting to keep up those firewalls. And so what we did is that we gave folks login so they could see that Raven map. They just couldn't see any of the data that was being gathered by the NGOs. And that was that's a 2-minute fix on the back end. Our hope and our vision is that ability to occlude data actually facilitates more information sharing, because organizations can be more secure in the knowledge that the information that is actually sensitive to them will not be spilled. And that's the vision over the long run. So with that, I think I'll wrap up. If you have any questions about this work in particular, about the philanthropy team in general, or about Palantir, I'm more than happy to answer them. Yes. Oh, and
were there data sets that you wish you had but didn't?
Say that again?
Were there data sets that you wish you had but didn't?
Yeah. The two big ones, or two ways I would think about it. One is I wish that I had the Philippine government's data on a more regular basis, because they actually did a really nice job of collecting data. I don't know how, that's the challenge, right? You get handed a data set, and if you weren't there when that data was collected, it's hard to know exactly how accurate it is. But I wish that that system was just more regularized ultimately between the Philippine government and the NGO community that was responding. That system didn't always work great, right? Just in terms of data. So I wish we had that more efficiently. And then I wish that we had ways to get all of the information that was being done by Philippine NGOs, because in the international system, those NGOs, the local, what they would call the host nation NGOs, aren't part, they're just not part of the quote-unquote cluster system. So they don't know, and their activities aren't sort of loaded up in. And so you're even when we pulled together a really comprehensive vision, this was about as comprehensive as anybody anywhere had, but you're still not looking at the data you don't have, right? And there were a lot of great Philippine NGOs that were doing really good work that wasn't going into this system. So what's happening now is our partner Direct Relief, without our assistance, is working with a range of NGOs in the Philippines. There's an organization called Gawad Kalinga, specifically, which is like Habitat for Humanity. is a good way to think of it, doing long-term housing recovery. And they're running around using inReach devices, collecting data, submitting it back, and I can pull up some of that data if you're interested. But that to us is something that we would like to demonstrate, that you can build information systems that make it so easy for everybody to put data in, and that because it's in the cloud, everybody can then access the appropriate amount of data, that you actually get a much more comprehensive picture of what's going on. And that's sort of the vision that we have going forward. Frankly, though, we approach that vision primarily from a technological side. And, to make this happen, we're going to need, organizational partners that really have expertise and authority in the space that are going to have to drive that process.
Hi, really, really cool piece of software. Excuse me. It seems like this is very resource focused. So you're looking at hospitals, infrastructure.
Yeah.
Whereas it seems like ultimately you're hoping to be more, or you would like to be more human-centered. So something like after the Boston Marathon bombing, where there were essentially Google spreadsheets set up to find housing for people.
Yep.
Can you imagine some of this software tracking people rather than resources?
Yeah, absolutely. Though we would have to ask a lot of questions about PII, personally identifiable information, in those situations. In truly crisis settings, people have slightly different standards there, but we're any big data company worth its salt is obviously concerned about those issues and thinks about them very hard, and we certainly do. The bottom line is but we haven't really done it. With the exception of volunteers that are cadres of an organization. So, for example, Team Rubicon's volunteer corps. Team Rubicon leadership can, do that original, just draw a radius or draw a circle and figure out who lives inside of it. Things along those lines. There are a range of use cases for that kind of functionality that really do matter. For example, if you are having in that volunteer base, if you have somebody in a moment of crisis, and there are many veterans that go through those moments of crisis, being able to find friends, people that have been on deployments with them, people that live nearby, and that kind of functionality is something that we are increasingly looking at with them as those kinds of issues do come up. So, but yeah, at the end of the day, the ontology, what we call the ontology, or just the schema for the mapping of the data, right? In Palantir is dynamic, which means that we can, add, subtract, change the way that objects are, the types of objects we have, the types of properties on them. So at the end of the day, if we're talking about people, it's a matter of, from a Palantir standpoint, it's just another object, right? A house is just another object with, a property of a certain number of bedrooms that are either available or unavailable. Yeah.
Question right here.
As you probably know, the people in the Bay Area are waiting for the next big earthquake. I'm wondering if Palantir is working with any of the organizations, government or NGOs in the Bay Area to improve their access to data or their data collection.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So we are working with a couple of state agencies, and we're talking to some of the emergency services folks. We're not actively working with those folks right now. We work with police departments and fire departments, both here and in Southern California. The big exciting thing, though, is that we are partners in an effort called the Rockefeller 100 Resilient Cities effort, which some of you may know of. But it's a $100 million effort by the Rockefeller Foundation to sponsor what they call chief resilience officers in 100 cities around the globe. And those cities include San Francisco. In the first round, the first 33 cities, San Francisco is one, Oakland is one, Alameda is one. I want to say, is it Berkeley? Okay, I was going to say Fremont, but it's probably Berkeley makes sense. So we are one of the sort of originating technology. We are the originating technology partner with the Rockefeller Foundation on that effort. That's still pretty nascent. The cities were announced 3 months ago. And we will be working with Rockefeller and those cities, though, on the resilience projects that they deem fit, right? And it would be, I could speculate that will be earthquake sort of preparedness. That's where I'd put my effort. But at the end of the day, the way that we work is side by side in conjunction with our partners, and so if that's what the cities are interested in, that's what we'll work on. Yeah. There are a lot of great data feeds out there, though, that are really kind of fun. From U.S., the U.S. government rightly gets a lot of flack for not releasing information, but the scientific agencies do a great job. USGS, NASA, the Weather Service. You can get a lot of really wonderful information that's just open that we use all the time, pushing into data feeds and pushing into instances for our partners. So.
Yeah, hello. Yeah, we are having a drought situation in California, and I'm wondering where is their water coming from? Are we sending them bottled water from Hawaii, maybe the Asian continent?
To the Philippines?
Right. Due to Superstorm Haiyan in the Philippines.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I would imagine that it's probably sourced more locally in Asia somewhere. But I don't know that. Looking at supply chains is actually a really interesting one. When we talk about, I mentioned the human trafficking piece, and some of my partners in crime at Palantir are looking very much at how do they help companies understand supply chains so that they can understand, particularly in Southeast Asia, where there's a lot of this, child labor and in some cases sex trafficking and all sorts of things. But in California, for example, has a law now that requires that companies at least do due diligence on their supply chains to try to understand whether or not there is forced labor in those supply chains at some subsidiary or upstream supplier. So that's the kind of question that we are increasingly looking to be able to answer more directly. Yeah.
What is the fun story from West Point to Palantir?
The fun story from West Point to Palantir. Okay, so when I was the research director at CTC, most folks that don't have experience with a place like West Point think of it as sort of a hyper military institution, and really it's a very sort of weird hybrid military and academic institution. And so we were able to get information declassified about Al-Qaeda's foreign fighters coming into Iraq, of which there were many. That information was declassified to us. The U.S., the formal government agencies, their question when they get these, these are personnel forms, all right, like same as you would fill out, right, when you work anywhere. What's your name, what's your phone number, what's your address, who's your emergency contact, what kind of skills do you have, all these kinds of things, right? Fascinating, from an intelligence standpoint, right? You can imagine that the military, they were primarily interested in is like, well, where are these people right now? And that didn't interest us so much at West Point. We were more interested in why in the world did these people sign up for this in the first place, right? Because many of them, more than half, were determined to become suicide bombers in Iraq. And so we did, there were about 800 of these documents. We did an academic report in which we used Stata to run the statistics. And Palantir came to us right about the time that Palantir was ready to have with a real product, and said, "Hey, we'll help out. Throw this data into Palantir. Let's see what we find." And we had done it the hard way already, right? We had run most of the regressions, most of the just basic statistics. But what we didn't realize was that there were a set of questions and a set of personalities in this data that we could ask questions about that we didn't even realize. And that was the facilitators that were helping these people get through Syria. Where what Al-Qaeda in Iraq at the time was worried about was that there were facilitators in Syria that were ripping off their recruits, right? Because they were just human smugglers. And so they were asking a lot of questions about these people. How much money did they take from you? Et cetera, right? And what you could do is you could impute things about these different these different facilitators, because some of them took money, some of them didn't, etc. And we didn't even realize that there was data there that we could really ask questions about these facilitators, and that's why having sort of an intuitive sort of graphical system, what we like to call an operating system for data, where it just sort of jumped out that, oh, there are some actors here that we didn't even realize were sort of central and we could ask questions about and draw conclusions, at least, initial conclusions. And that was the value. And so that's how I met Palantir and ultimately came on when the philanthropy team was standing up because, frankly, thinking about terrorism all day gets pretty depressing. Yeah.
Thank you so much for a fantastic talk.
Thanks, guys.